Welcome to Let's Talk Thyroid, where we explore different aspects of living a healthy thyroid lifestyle, positively and practically, to help you thrive and not just survive. Join me, Annabelle Bateman, your host, and let's talk thyroid. This podcast has been proudly supported by, me. I am fully backing my podcast and getting the Let's Talk Thyroid message out to you. If you are interested in purchasing essential oils, that is one of the ways that you can support me and I can support you, and essential oils can support your overall thyroid health and wellness. So if that's something that you would like to add to your health and wellness toolkit of resources that you can access to support you in a number of different ways, send me a message. I'd love to help you find what suits your individual needs and budget. Or you can head to annabellebateman.com and follow the links there to essential oils. Think digestive support, stress management, reducing your toxic load, all sorts of ways that we can use essential oils as part of our overall lifestyle approach to managing health and wellness. Today we're going to dive right into going gluten-free. We're going to explore the why, the where and the what of a gluten-free diet in today's episode, which I'm calling Going Gluten-Free Part 1. And in Part 2, which we'll explore over the next, probably in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to look at the how. How do you really do this? Let's really break it down and make it very doable. But I'm going to give you some tips along the way today as well. Because look, it took me about 10 years to give up gluten. I'd dabble, I'd go gluten-free, it seemed too hard. I'm like, I love food too much, I love cooking, I like eating. And it didn't seem to be bad enough. I didn't feel bad enough, I suppose, to really cut it out. And I wasn't convinced that it mattered enough. So I dabbled. From when I first heard that I should, it would probably benefit my health to not eat gluten, it really took me almost 10 years to give it up completely, which was about 7 years ago. So really now I would say my bottom line is I don't eat gluten, or certainly not deliberately. So I might have a little bit inadvertently, but otherwise I am gluten-free. I would say I largely follow a paleo-ish diet. So I don't think generally that gluten-free, it may not be enough for your health, but it's a good place to start. And if you don't want to go the whole, looking at removing all inflammatory foods, there's a lot of information about gluten-free. So that's why I thought I'd start with this one. But we will definitely be exploring food, paleo, inflammatory foods, autoimmune paleo, all those different things over time. So know that if removing gluten from your diet, particularly if you're still eating other grains, if that's not enough, it may not be, just know that there are other things that you can explore, to feel better in your gut health and your thyroid health and all of those things. So let's dig right in. Know your why. So why go gluten-free? Why do you want to go gluten-free? And that's going to be different for each one of us. And I can't tell you why you should go gluten-free. Maybe you shouldn't. That's up to you to figure that out for yourself. But for me, once I really understood more about gluten, how it worked in my gut, how it contributed to leaky gut and the connection between leaky gut and autoimmune disease, and the link between having one autoimmune disease and the propensity to acquire further autoimmune diseases, that over time, the more I dug into that, the more I spoke to my doctor, the more I read and researched, that became enough for me to give up gluten. And the way I went about that was about 7 years ago, I did a Whole30 program, which was basically hardcore paleo for 30 days, cutting out gluten, grains, dairy, sugars, legumes, alcohol, and focusing on nutrient-rich food. And at the end of that 30 days, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not bloated every time I eat. I had more energy. It really made a very big difference to how I felt. And so from then, I have not knowingly gone back to gluten. Some of the other things I have I will have some non-glutinous grains, I will have some dairy, sugar sneaks in. That's why I say I follow a paleo-ish diet. Certainly I feel best probably when I follow a paleo diet more strictly, but so that's the way I went about doing it, which is not necessarily how you might want to do it. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but understanding why. I knew that I didn't want to acquire other autoimmune diseases. I knew that was probably my biggest motivator, actually. And then once I had really cut it out, and then if I knew I had it inadvertently, I would get diarrhea, I could have pains in the stomach. So then I knew that it really didn't agree with my system. So that was my why. You've got to work out your why. But if you don't, then it's going to be much harder to stick with it and make it a lifestyle. That would probably be, so know why. Do some reading research. I often recommend the book Grain Brain by David Perlmutter. I found that really helpful for understanding the gut-brain connection and leaky gut and the connection to autoimmune disease. So that was a really significant read for me. The next question is know where to find it. So where is gluten? Where does it live? What products is it in? How do I know if I'm going to go gluten-free, how do I actually avoid it? So I need to know where it is. So the obvious places that gluten is in gluten-containing grains, which are wheat, rye, spelt, barley, and oats. There is some debate about oats, but most people who would follow a gluten-free diet or celiac won't eat oats. So the less obvious in processed foods often, like sauces, marinades, soy sauce, hot chips, for example, the coating, often there's a flour coating, but not always, so you've got to check that. Personal care products even can have some wheat in them, like shampoo, some makeup, I think. Certainly I've looked into shampoos can have it. So we need to get good at reading labels. We need to looking at packets and seeing, does it contain gluten? We do, at least in Australia where I am, it does have to say whether there's gluten detected. And so that just reading labels can be a pretty helpful place to start. And get in the habit of looking and of asking questions. So we will talk in a little bit about eating out, but that's where it's really helpful to get into that habit of knowing where gluten can be so you know how to ask the right questions. There are some great websites that I'm going to put in the show notes that will give you some more information about where gluten can hide. So celiac.org.au is our Australian celiac website that's got a lot of information in there about being gluten-free, and the Celiac Australia app is quite handy. You can look up individual products and see if they contain gluten. And I'm sure if you're outside of Australia, you'll have a similar organisation. And because when you've got celiac disease, you cannot have any gluten. I think when you go to those websites, those organisations, they're going to have the most thorough information. I found another really helpful article that I'll put the link in the show notes from a website called glutenfreelabels.com, and there's had a lot of really interesting places where it could be, like in your lipstick or your, like I said before, your sauces, marinades. So that was quite a helpful article. I popped the link in there. I think when we're talking about grains, it's helpful to know which grains do not contain gluten. So if you're wanting to have grains or cereals or breads or pastas, like you want to look for ones that are made out of non-glutinous grains, which would be things like rice, quinoa, most corn flour, but you do need to check that it's not wheaten corn flour, buckwheat flour, things like millet. There's a whole lot of non-glutinous grains. So be aware that, if you're just looking at cutting out gluten, they could be a really helpful things to include if you're wanting to look for replacements. Just also be aware, though, that there is a thing called gluten cross-reactivity, which essentially means that you can have something that does not contain gluten, but your body responds to it as if it is gluten. So you can go do some research into gluten cross-reactivity, and a lot of grains do come up there. So for me, generally, I feel better without most grains, but gluten is probably the biggest culprit and the biggest contributor to that leaky gut for a lot of people, from what I've read and understand. So that's where to find it. What I want to focus on now is to focus on what you can have. Like, what can I eat? What's left? Is there anything actually left? What do I possibly eat? And let me tell you, going gluten-free isn't miserable. And in fact, it actually opens up a whole different realm of yummy food, of creative cooking, of nutritious, nutrient-dense food. I often think that the gluten-containing foods are what I call empty fillers, which when you've got a whole lot of teenage boys like I do, I've got 3 teenage boys, the youngest one's almost a teenager, and sometimes they just need filling up. And so they're not gluten-free. In my household, I'm the only one that's strictly gluten-free. But when I look at filling them up, it's things like Weet-Bix and rice and, pasta and bread. And, so to me, they're the empty fillers. So if we've cut them out, what do we actually fill up on? Well, lots of things. I mean, it goes back to meat and 3 veg is often a really basic but helpful way of looking at food and meal planning when you're eating gluten-free. So I'm going to give you some ideas for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and some snack ideas. And let me tell you, there's heaps of recipes on whatannabellecooks.com, and I've got a lot in my cookbook, which is called What Annabelle Cooks, Real Food That Will Make You Flourish. It's all gluten, grain and dairy free, the recipes in there. And there's more than just recipes. In the cookbook, I talk a lot about eating out, traveling, how to assemble a meal, how to approach meal planning. So there's more in there than just recipes, but there are a lot of recipes covering breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, sweet treats, desserts. And some basics. So there's lots of different recipes in there. So let's tackle it from the top down, or from the beginning of the day, because often when people want to cut out gluten, they're like, well, what am I going to eat for breakfast? I mean, breakfast is typically, your cereal and toast, which is your grains, which is gluten. So I would challenge you to rethink breakfast. Breakfast can be a whole lot of different things other than cereal and toast. In fact, breakfast is probably one of my favourite meals. I prefer breakfast to lunch, and often I'll have what I call breakfast foods for lunch. So here are some breakfast ideas. Why not have an omelette? Eggs are really great to have. For some people, eggs can be a bit irritating, but if not, eggs are fantastic. So omelette, you can fry up some veggies and, put an egg in the pan, and you kind of like have an egg, a fried egg veggie breakfast. And it sounds like that would take a long time, but really it doesn't. It really might take 5 minutes. You could have a smoothie. Now, smoothies you've got to be a little bit careful of. I'm careful with smoothies because I like fruit. Even if I add a whole lot of greens, I do like a bit of banana or something sweet, and that can set me up for a sweet craving day. But it also mixes things up and good if you're in a hurry. So smoothies could be a good breakfast. I often make a paleo muesli, and I've got quite a few different recipes on What Annabelle Cooks, and there's a nuts and seed muesli recipe in the cookbook. But generally I use things like coconut flakes, almond flakes, or any kind of nuts. If I'm using some non-glutinous grains, I might use rice puffs or millet puffs or something like that just to pad it out a bit. But if I'm going completely paleo with no grains, then it's probably more coconut nuts, sunflower seeds, pepitas, hemp seeds, those sorts of things. And I toss a bit of coconut oil with some turmeric and often I'll use my essential oils in my muesli, like a few drops of ginger and wild orange, or last night I used lemon and turmeric in this week's batch. And so if you want that crunch of, muesli and cereal, you could have it with a bit of milk or almond milk, whatever milk you like. And that feels like you're having cereal. So if you want that, that's a good breakfast. And even just having leftovers for breakfast is a great option. So it's rethinking, getting out of your head that breakfast equals cereal and toast, and just thinking of it from a different perspective. Lunch. Now, I often think of lunch and breakfast almost interchangeably, not always, and as I said, I will often have breakfast for lunch. Leftovers, another great idea for lunch. I'll often use like hot smoked salmon and salad as a lunch. You could use cauliflower bread and make a sandwich. I suppose it's been so many years since I've had a sandwich for lunch, but if you really wanted that, like a cauliflower bread or a gluten-free bread, one of like Helga's or Abbott's make quite a soft gluten-free bread that is okay as a sandwich. A lot of other gluten-free bread really is only palatable if it's frozen. Not if it's frozen, if it's toasted. Now, when it comes to dinner, I really do think meat and veg. What protein am I going to have and what vegetables am I going to have with it? It's pretty much as simple as that. So whether it, chicken, beef, pork, fish, eggs, whatever sort of protein, and then what vegetables will I have with it. And look, I live in Queensland. Most of the year it's pretty hot up here. We are in the middle of winter at the moment, and I'll do lots of roasted vegetables, but in summer, heaps of salad. So I'll do meat, chicken and salad, beef and salad, pulled pork and salad, even a pulled pork taco where I use the lettuce leaf as a shell. I'll do that. Maybe the rest of the household might have, like, say, a burrito wrap, but I'll wrap it in a lettuce leaf. So those are the sorts of tweaks often that I will make to dinner. And it's pretty common too. Actually, someone asked in the Facebook community, well, how do I do kind of gluten-free on a budget and across a whole family where everyone's needs are slightly different? And look, I've got to say, the on a budget part is tough. Your empty fillers are cheap, and so that does make cooking, if you base a whole meal around pasta or rice, it's a lot cheaper than basing that meal around meat and vegetables. I understand that. So I do think in terms of quality of meat and vegetables, just do the best you can with the budget that you've got. And you don't have to have lots of meat, just have a bit of meat and lots of vegetables. And there are some great veggie co-ops and things around these days to help keep those costs down. In terms of variety, what I do in my household is I'll cook what I call a variation on a theme. So, for example, if I'm making spaghetti bolognese for the kids, then I will have the bolognese on a bed of English spinach leaves or zucchini noodles. So I'll tend to just not have the carb element. I would have carbs in the form of sweet potato or potato, but not in the form of grains. So the flip side of looking at that is if I was cooking, say pulled pork is a good example, then I will cook rice to go with that for the boys, so that really pads it out for them, gives them some more bulk and more filler. And so they will have their pulled pork on rice with some veggies, maybe in a burrito wrap, whereas I will have it just with the vegetables, maybe in a lettuce taco. Or if we're having it with tacos, I will have a taco shell, but I won't have a burrito wrap. So, I kind of do those, what I call that variation on a theme. Some snack ideas. If you're cutting out the gluten, would be certainly fruit and nuts. Medjool dates I really like. A medjool date with a celery stick and a little handful of nuts is a really nice snack. It's got that texture. It's got a bit of sweet. It's got a bit of crunchy. It's got some, that texture. I find jerky a really great snack. It's chewy, keeps my mouth going. It's got that real, you got to work for it. And, I like that protein nature of jerky as a snack. And look, I often find too, is when I am eating well and balanced and eating a good breakfast and lunch, then I don't tend to need to snack as much. I guess maybe my blood sugar levels are a little bit more balanced, and so I'm not going for those snacks quite so often. But like I said, I've got lots of different snack ideas in the cookbook and on the website as well. So hopefully that gives you some ideas as to what you can have. You can have protein, fruits, nuts, eggs, seeds, and there's so many. And I think that's the thing that we want to focus on if we're cutting something out, is to focus on what we can have. Maybe, as we walk through the fruit and vegetable section, let's try different vegetables. Let's include all the different colours of the rainbow. Let's try vegetables that we haven't tried before, or try cooking them in a different way, or chopping them in a different way. Play with size and texture of your vegetables. Play with the colours, and just make it a bit more interesting. I think, we do eat with our eyes, and having texture and different textures in our food, I think, is really important. And you don't want to feel deprived. This is not about deprivation. This is about health and about supporting our health. So let's focus on all the good, yummy food that we can have. And there's heaps. And like I've got to say, there's a gazillion recipes online. If you're looking for gluten-free, like I tend to look for paleo recipes, because then they've not just replaced the gluten with gluten-free grains. I find if I'm searching for a recipe, I'll look for a paleo version, because that's not just going to it's just, I prefer to eat that way. But there's lots and lots of different cookbooks and people to follow, and lots of different recipes. So it just takes that little bit of extra planning and experimenting, and just it's a headset, it's a mindset thing, isn't it? Like the more we've tried, the more we've explored, the more we've enjoyed food, then I think it just becomes easier and it becomes part of our lifestyle. So while we're focusing on what we can have, I just want to have a chat just for a minute about one of the biggest tips that I've got is to find alternatives, not replacements, if you can. And so what I mean by that is, don't just replace cakes with gluten-free cakes, bread with gluten-free bread, pasta with gluten-free pasta. Try to, if you can, go without the cake or the bread or the pasta, because that will help you focus then in on that nutrient-dense food. But if your personality or your family situation or your headspace needs more of a transition, where you actually need, you think you would transition to a gluten-free lifestyle more easily by incorporating some of those gluten-free products, then do that. Like, this is about what works best for you. What works best for me, or what worked best initially, was to just not have those. Now I will have a bit, and I'll have some. I found some gluten-free bread that I like, that I'll often have with an egg for breakfast. But I've had years where I didn't have that. And so I think my gut has healed a lot. And so now I can tolerate more of that. So this is where we're all individual. We've all got to work with what our needs are, our health situation is, our budgets are, our family situation, and I guess our relationship with food as well. So I'm a bit of an all or nothing personality. That's why I think I found it easier just to cut it all out, go hardcore, and then over time things sort of come back in, and then I'll have periods where I go hardcore again. And when I say hardcore, what I mean is I'll go pretty strictly paleo. And, from time to time I'll run 30-day wellness challenges, and I'm planning on doing one in September. So if this sounds like something that you want, that you would be keen to be part of, I'll look at doing another group session in September where we, focus in on the paleo aspect. So that's the no gluten, grains, dairy, sugars, legumes. But I wanted to start this podcast really just looking at the gluten-free because it is probably an easier place to start. Now, I've had a couple of questions in the Facebook group. I said that I was doing an episode on going gluten-free, and so a couple of the questions that I've been asked I'll cover now. So one of them is around that, where it says it may contain gluten on a packet, and do we need to worry about that? Does that, how far do we go with, I guess, the gluten-free? And I suppose what I would say is, well, we've all got to work that out for ourselves. If you're celiac, then you will know absolutely you can't have any gluten, and the may contain gluten, you may not be able to have that. And so that's why I said before, going to the celiac websites can be really helpful because they will have the strictest information. There is actually a high correlation between people with Hashimoto's and celiac disease. Often people will have both. And so I do think that we need, if you're here with Hashimoto's, and I'm not sure if it's the same with Graves', but it could be because it's the autoimmune connection. But certainly with Hashimoto's and celiac, if you know you have Hashimoto's, it's worth looking into the celiac aspect, particularly if you've got a lot of gut issues. And I know for me, I have the celiac gene. I've been tested for celiac antibodies. I haven't done the full celiac test. So I don't have celiac disease, but I know I have the propensity. So I do think eating a gluten-free diet is helpful for not triggering that. But for me, I have decided that I can probably tolerate the tiny bits of cross-contamination. So I'm not super strict about when I'm eating out asking if the chips have been fried in a separate fryer or the bread has been toasted in a separate toaster. But if I was celiac, I would have to ask that. I would need to be that diligent. So for me, it may contain gluten. I'm okay with that. I will eat that. But I do think that's really, again, it's an individual thing. You have to work that out for your health, maybe in conjunction with your health practitioner. And if you think that you could have celiac disease, then definitely you want to investigate that, because that is, you do need to be really strict with the gluten in that situation. Another question I was asked in the group is, are there brands that you recommend for gluten-free products? And again, I guess take on board what I said before about if we can avoid that gluten-free product, that's probably better. But having said that, there are a few brands that I like. And the main things people ask about that is really, say, your breads and your pastas, because there's a lot of variation. There are some really horrid gluten-free breads. There are some really awful, gluggy gluten-free pastas. So in terms of bread, the ones that I have found that are quite palatable, in terms of, we're talking Australian market here, but the supermarket brands, Helga's and Abbott's, both do a pretty similar gluten-free bread. They have a few different like grains or white or those type of things, but they're quite bready, soft. You could have a sandwich with them. I quite like, I've come across recently the gluten-free bakehouse, which I'll put the link in the show notes because you can buy from them online. And I like their pumpkin seed bread and their fruit bread. They're quite small pieces. I like them toasted. That's if I'm going to have an egg on toast, that's what I'll use. So that's been a fairly recent discovery for me. I quite like, it's kind of palatable. I quite like that one. In terms of pasta, I do give my kids gluten-free pasta, even though they're not strictly gluten-free. I find that's a way of just reducing their gluten and still giving them that extra carb for my teenage boys that are always hungry. And the pasta that I've found generally that cooks up the best, and really most people wouldn't know it was gluten-free, it's Buon Tempo, and pardon me, I'll put that in the show notes as well. It's a green packet. It's in the health food section. They do like spirals and penne, and I think it's just spirals and penne. So the spaghetti I use if I buy spaghetti or fettuccine is the San Remo gluten-free I think theirs is pretty good. Otherwise, in terms of brands, I'm really happy in the Facebook community. I think I'm going to get a conversation going so that we can all share with each other the different brands of gluten-free products that we have found. But there's heaps around now. It's so much easier to be gluten-free now than it was even 10, or sorry, certainly even 5 years ago. It's better than it was. Another question I was asked was about gluten-free flours, like the alternative flours to cook with. And look, oh my gosh, there's heaps of options. I tend to cook mostly with almond meal. I don't do a lot of cooking with pre-made gluten-free mixes because as I said before, generally grains I don't like to have a lot of those. So almond meal is probably the one I cook with the most, but I have cooked with banana flour, cauliflower flour, sweet potato flour, buckwheat flour. Of course, you've got rice flour, corn flour, tapioca, and you can buy different premixes. So again, I'm happy to have a conversation probably in the Facebook groups, probably the easiest place to do that, of if there's particular brands of gluten-free mixes that people like. I often will have one packet of a gluten-free flour mix just in case I'm wanting to, say crumb chicken nuggets or just for that little bit of flour rather than for making a whole cake out of. So lots of different alternative flours. And the last question I was asked was about eating out gluten-free and how to handle that. I think I will cover this in more detail in part 2 when we're really talking about the how, but let's just overview for eating out gluten-free is it's so much easier than it used to be. Most things are marked on menus these days. I think cafes and restaurants are pretty aware of the issues with gluten-free and particularly for celiacs. So most menus are marked or there's a gluten-free option. But I would say learn to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions and be an advocate for your own health because you don't want to assume that something is gluten-free when it's not. And I've definitely made that mistake before. So think about things like, for example, a hamburger could be gluten-free if you didn't eat the bread. So often I'll say, I'm just wondering if I didn't have the bread, is the hamburger gluten-free? Like, is the patty gluten-free? And often it is, sometimes it's not, so don't make that assumption. Same with your hot chips. I know these aren't healthy foods, but when we're eating out, sometimes we're looking for those things. Often hot chips are not gluten-free because they're covered in flour to give them that crispy edge. Things like soy sauce that might be in marinades or sauces, it's not gluten-free. So you need to check those things. So it's just learning to ask the questions. There are certain, if you're looking at different nationality foods, and gosh, we're so blessed in Australia to have such a wide range of multicultural foods to explore. I've got to say I've found Chinese to be the hardest. In fact, I've walked around Sunnybank with some friends and been refused at pretty much, at a number of different restaurants. Sorry, we don't even try to cater for gluten-free. So I do find Chinese quite hard. Vietnamese, in terms of Asian food, is probably the easiest. And traveling in Vietnam was a fantastic gluten-free because everything pretty much is gluten-free. So that was wonderful. Thai is usually pretty good. I've got to say I kind of avoid Italian restaurants, and I think, not to say that they don't cater for gluten-free, often they do, but I'm not really that interested in going out and having a big bowl of gluten-free pasta. If I was to go to an Italian restaurant, I'd look at the main meals, not the pastas or the pizzas, and I think, anyway, I don't have a lot of Italian food. So that's a bit of an eating out overview. I might go into a bit more detail in the how to really do this in the part 2 episode. So let's go over it. You want to know why you want to go gluten-free. You need to know where to find it so you can avoid it. And you need to focus on what you can have so that you really enjoy going gluten-free. In next week's episode, I am actually chatting with another member of our thyroid community, Sharon, who is willing to share her thyroid story. And we do touch in that conversation a fair bit about diet, actually. So enjoy that, and we'll pop in the week after with part 2 of the Going Gluten Free, where we really talk about how to do it, how to be prepared, how to approach it, and how to make it part of an everyday lifestyle. If you're not already in the Let's Talk Thyroid Facebook community, come and join us there, and let's have some great discussion this week about all things gluten-free. We can share brands, recipes, ideas, strategies, and really support each other, because that's what this community is all about. The link to join the group is in the show notes, or just search on Facebook for Let's Talk Thyroid. Have an awesome week, everyone. If diet is something that you're wanting to take a look at the moment, and you don't want to wait until I run a group 30-day challenge in September, I offer my 30-day challenge program any time of the year, whenever you're ready to start. There's a link in the show notes, or there's also a link on annabellebateman.com, and you can receive daily emails for 30 days, really helping support you follow a paleo diet. So that's not just the gluten like we've been talking about today, but gluten, grains, dairy, sugars, legumes, really cutting it out for 30 days, removing those typically inflammatory foods, just so that you can give your body a rest and see how you feel. It's a bit like an elimination diet. So if you want more information about that, jump on over to the website or find the link in the show notes. And if you want to wait and do it as part of a group, keep an eye out for information as it gets a bit closer to September. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Thyroid. I would love it if you would subscribe to the podcast and share it with others that you know with thyroid problems. Let's get the message out there. If you'd like to connect with me further, the best place to do that is via my website, annabellebateman.com. From there, you'll be able to join my Facebook group, book a strategy session with me, download my freebie, and access any show notes for this episode. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
The information presented and discussed in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease and should not be used as a substitute for proper advice from a qualified professional.